Immigration detention is an issue that has dogged federal governments in this country for years. It's a practice that sees some asylum seekers or migrants detained as they await legal processes around their immigration cases. Now, all 10 provinces have ended contracts with the feds to house these migrants in provincial jails. So the federal government is looking to move those people to immigration detention centers. However, a small percentage could be moved to federal prisons. That move is raising concerns with human rights and refugee organizations, as well as to former Liberal ministers, former Immigration Minister Lloyd Axworthy and former Justice Minister Allan Rock. Now, all of them signed a letter asking the government to reverse course. We spoke with Mr. Rock earlier today. Mr. Rock, thank you so much for joining us on Power Play. We appreciate it.
Nice to be here. So
I wanted to ask you about this letter that you wrote with your former Liberal Cabinet Minister Lloyd Axworthy as well. You're asking and urging the government to cancel its plans to start using federal prisons to hold immigration detainees. Why?
It's just wrong, Michael. The CBSA seems to take the position that detaining migrants or asylum seekers is the default judgment. When someone comes to the country as a migrant or seeking asylum, they have a discretion whether to allow them into the community or whether to detain them. And just too many people are being detained. In fact, in the last 8 years, 45,000 people have been detained. Now, mostly that's in the holding centers, but it also involved provincial jails until recently. Over the last few years, as a result of the advocacy of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, all 10 provinces have ended their contracts with the federal government, allowing for the use of provincial jails. That's good news. So we thought the point's been made and the effort has succeeded. Then when the budget was tabled in April, the Government of Canada announced it was going to employ federal prisons in the absence of provincial jails. And it's just wrong. I mean, CBSA will tell you that there are people who constitute a public safety risk for Canada. But the reality is that 90% of those 45,000 who were detained over the last 8 years were detained because of flight risk, a concern that they wouldn't turn up for their hearings. And there are all kinds of less extreme measures of dealing with that, including monitoring in the community, which is available to CBSA and which they sometimes use. But they overused detention. And frankly, putting someone who arrives as a migrant or asylum seeker into a criminal environment, they haven't been accused or convicted of any crime in Canada, is just plain wrong. And that's why we've asked the Government of Canada to reconsider this policy.
But Minister Miller, the Immigration Minister, has said that, look, they're put into separate housing, and these are not criminals being intermingled with criminals either. This is really just different places to make sure that they are being held there, and saying that it's a very small number. In fact, one of the statements that we got from the Minister of Public Safety said that as of May 10th, 2024, 38 people were being held in provincial correctional facilities. So if it's just a small number, what's your response to that?
Well, you know, CBSA has been difficult to pin down on numbers as we've done this work. It's the only police-like force in the country which does not have independent, impartial supervision. So it's on its own. And they have a security approach or mentality which tends to see boogeymen behind every door and threats to the public safety behind every person. They overreact with detention. And I would like to double check that number, but the fact is that resorting to a criminal environment, a punitive environment for migrants and asylum seekers is plain wrong.
Even though they say it's not a criminal environment, they're saying that these are high risk and often people with severe mental problems, and they're saying that's what they have to do at this point. You disagree?
Well, I disagree very much so. Prison is not the place in which we deal with mental health issues. That's the last place in the world you'd go if you want support for mental health issues.
I just underline the separate housing issue. They say it's separate housing within the facility.
But they're in a federal prison, and that's just wrong. They already have federal holding centers, 3 of them, in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, which have a capacity of over 400 people. It's like a medium security prison environment. Why don't they use those for these security risks? They're there. In fact, the budget has allocated hundreds of millions of dollars to upgrade those holding centers. So That's it. You know, immigration is an administrative issue, not a criminal one. And we shouldn't mix the two. If someone arrives in the country seeking asylum and there's some question about whether they'll turn up for their hearing, resorting to a criminal mechanism is not the right solution. And so we think it's just got to change.
On that question of the budget allocations, we did get a statement again from Dominic LeBlanc. It reads here, through the proposed legislative measures and the sums invested in budget 2024, the Canada Border Services agencies will be able to handle a greater number of high-risk detainees in its own facilities. They will not mingle with federal inmates. We will never compromise the safety of Canadians. Your response to that?
Well, the holding centers are intended for immigrants, for migrants and asylum seekers who come to the country until the paperwork is sorted out. So we understand, we think that they're overused as well, but they're a lot better option than putting people in federal prisons. So we think that, again, mixing the criminal model with an administrative issue is going in the wrong direction. It's bad policy, it's unnecessary. And you know, 17 people have died in immigration detention since the year 2000. Immigration detention is for an indefinite period of time. It's not as though you're there for 30 days or 40 days. It can be for an indefinite period of time. So if you combine all those factors, you see that this is a real risk to the health and safety of people who come to the... You know, we think of Canada as a nation of refuge. And I can't imagine anything more inconsistent with that self-image than using either provincial jails or federal prisons to hold migrants until the paperwork is done.
So what's a tenable fix here? Clearly the government seems to be going in this direction and thinks that, again, that it is a small number, and you're saying any number is too much. So what would really be the proper solution here in your mind?
Well, the position we've advocated is that detention should be limited only to those cases where there's a true risk to public safety. And I concede that in this difficult world, that happens, all right? But when detention does occur, we have almost 400 places in federally funded holding centers in 3 provinces that are more than capable of accommodating those people. You don't have to resort to the criminal justice system. So I say the solution is use detention only in those rare cases of true public...
Even though they say they do, that it's rare, that it's a minimal number.
They say so, but 45,000 over the last 8 years, Michael? That's not rare. That's common practice. And, you know, as I say, I'd like to look more closely at those numbers. The fact is that CBSA uses detention too often. It's too widespread a practice, and it shouldn't be mixed with the criminal justice system. If you want to detain someone on that ground, the federal government has already bought and paid for 400 places in its own holding centers that are sort of medium security. That's the place to put them.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Former Federal Justice Minister Allan Rock, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.